Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for those who've joined in so far. We'll get started now, and for those who come in late, they'll be updated at that time that we are recording this evening. So if there is anything anyone has missed, they can definitely catch up on it as required. Please make sure that your camera is turned off and your microphone is muted, particularly if you do not want to be recorded during this session. So welcome everyone to our second ever Young Geographers Forum. This is an initiative of RGSQ's Young Geographers group, chaired by myself and Giselle Pickering across the table here, to provide an opportunity for students and young professionals who are part of the Young Geographers group to talk about their research, their current work experiences, and generally share what they've been up to. So we've got a really great lineup of speakers for you this evening. I'll hopefully give you a really broad breadth of different topics across geography and give everyone a really good idea of what they've been up to. Please hold all your questions to the end, but throw them into the chat window so we can start compiling them, and between myself and Giselle we'll get them compiled and ready for the Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, we'll throw to Cara.
Hello, my name's Cara and I'm a honours student at UQ, so I'm about 4 weeks away from finishing up my Bachelor of Science honours. So I completed a Bachelor of Science last year in Geographical Science and have been doing my honours on, I guess you would call it atmospheric science or meteorology. So my project is investigating the spatial and temporal characteristics of landfalling atmospheric rivers over Australia, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially looking at atmospheric rivers over Australia, which are basically, which are essentially exactly what they sound like. So that picture that I've just put up on the screen there is showing water vapor transport over the globe. You can see those really thin, narrow stretches shooting off to the north and south that look like rivers. That is essentially what atmospheric rivers are. Oh, that's essentially what atmospheric rivers are. So you can see there's one hitting the western coast of the US. So that's a really famous one called the Pineapple Express. There's another one reaching out that looks like it could hit Western Europe. So these features are pretty much resemble rivers, hence the name. So one fact that I found pretty crazy when I started looking at them is the average amount of moisture or water vapor in these systems equates to about twice the flow of the Amazon River. So even though these systems only cover about 10% of the Earth's circumference, they account for 90% of the global water vapor transport to the mid-latitudes. So why are they important? So that picture up there is looking at atmospheric river landfalls across the world in terms of frequency days per year. So you can see that the Western US gets a lot of landfalls, same with Western Europe, Western South America, and you can also see that Western Australia and New Zealand actually get quite a few landfalls as well. So this is important because when these systems hit land, a lot of the time they get forced upward by topography. So they exist in about the bottom 2 kilometres of the atmosphere. So it means if you get a big mountain range or something in your continents or along the coast, these systems are forced upwards, your air condenses and you get huge amounts of precipitation. So the features themselves have a sort of a dual impact in that they're critical for water resources, but they can also pose hydrological hazards. So they often cause a lot of flash flooding, for example, in the Western US. So that makes them really important to understand and even try and try and get some sort of predictive capacity for them. So one of the issues with research so far, so they're not new systems, they've been around for a while and swapped names a few times, but the main issue is that most of the research on them has been done in the Northern Hemisphere. So that means that anytime someone comes up with an algorithm to detect these features, or a model to predict these features, they're all based on Northern Hemisphere parameters. So For example, most of the studies have been the Western USA, so a lot of the models that have been developed are very specific to that region. And as you saw from our previous picture, Australia and other places in the Southern Hemisphere get a lot of landfalls. So really, we haven't had enough scientific attention for what actually goes on down here. And I guess another point I wanted to make with this slide is that an official definition of them was actually only included in the Glossary of Meteorology in 2018. So people are very much still trying to figure out these features and understand them. So the only time that Australian atmospheric rivers have been captured in any sort of study is these global studies, which are of course quite a broad brush scale. And they all identified this region of high water vapour transport just to the southwest of Australia. So I basically wanted to understand, does that exist? When we look at Australia in a regional context at a higher resolution, are these global studies on the mark? Or are they missing something because of, one, the parameters that they're using, which are very Northern Hemisphere based, and two, because they don't know the sort of regional Australian climatology. And why I mention the Australian climatology is that we already have quite a bit of research on these features called northwest cloud bands. They've actually been in the news a little bit recently because we had two huge ones over Australia just a couple of weeks ago. But essentially these systems are big continental scale bands of cloud, and they provide the majority of our winter precipitation. So you can see in that photo there, they're very connected to the tropics. You can almost imagine water vapour flowing from the tropics, from the northwest down to the southeast. So because of that, myself and my research group figured that they have very similar characteristics to atmospheric rivers, but there's been no studies actually linking the two or seeing what the interaction is between the two. So that was something else that I wanted to do with my study. So speaking of my study, sorry, the words are mainly for me to remember, so don't feel the need to read all of that. But essentially I wanted to identify a suitable criteria that I could use for the Southern Hemisphere and suitable thresholds and parameters that aren't necessarily based on the Northern Hemisphere ones that would actually accurately represent Australia's atmospheric rivers. And then with those, I wanted to develop an atmospheric river detection algorithm in Python to produce a catalogue of landfalling atmospheric rivers over Australia for the summers and winters of the last 22 years. So I chose the summers and winters because you get the greatest contrast there. Atmospheric rivers are typically more common in winter, but some papers have suggested that they're more common in summer in the Southern Hemisphere because of the, especially around Australia, because we have more moisture in the atmosphere. I then wanted to conduct a manual analysis on them, on each event in ArcGIS, because I'm a very visual person and I really wanted to do more of a spatial analysis on them. To then develop a climatology of the landfalling Australian atmospheric rivers using a composite approach. So all that is basically piling up all the atmospheric river images on top of each other and seeing what the average conditions that they occur in are. So piling up all the winter atmospheric rivers that we identify and seeing if there's any patterns in terms of the surrounding climate of when they occur. And then that last point there is Australia as a continent is affected by quite an array of large-scale climate processes. So it's basically seeing how these features fit within the variability of these systems. So this is the output from the Python algorithm that I developed. So we can see here, I actually used two different thresholds just to be a bit more robust, because again, most of them are developed in the Northern Hemisphere and it'll just be a static number. So it'll be a moisture transport of greater than 250, for example. So therefore, for this study, I wanted to look at a lower threshold and a higher threshold just to see the difference that makes. So you can see here, this is essentially what the algorithm spits out. It's looking at systems that are above this moisture threshold, but that are also greater than 2,000 kilometres in length. and that's another very traditional criteria of atmospheric rivers. That's what it looks like when I put the same event into ArcGIS. So what you're seeing there is the moisture transport itself. So with the bright yellow being really high and the blue being pretty low. You can clearly see the system there and just see the scale of them. I'm sure you can imagine the amount of moisture that's stored in those. Just another thing to note here, so I divided Australia into 4 quadrants. So therefore we can look at the landfall patterns and 4 different areas of the continent, because Australia is a big country, and therefore we don't expect the patterns to be the same over the entire continent. These are some of the results that have come from, so these are basically dates of the catalogue that I compiled. So I identified a total of 171 atmospheric river events over the last 22 years. And these are some of the sort of repeating shapes that I found. You can see there's this really nice one in the middle that is very impressive looking and very nice. And when you look at the rain map for it, you see the nice swath of rain mirroring the shape of the river. And then there's some other different ones here. So you get these ones affecting North Queensland. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. Ones affecting North Queensland. And you get these more continental ones. And then these bottom 2 here, where they more affect the south and southwest of Australia, which, if you have a good memory, is similar to where the other studies predicted most of Australia's landfalls would be. So sort of the west-southwestern. So what I sort of found from this is that maybe those global studies didn't have a high enough resolution to capture these more continental atmospheric rivers that hit Australia, which look to be basically really intense northwest cloud bands. So what the conclusion is that I came to there is that while not all northwest cloud bands are atmospheric rivers, the really intense ones are. What else? We got some. So this is looking at the landfalls more closely. So I've just got a summer and winter breakdown with the higher bar representing the most landfalls. You can see in summer it's very much the south of Australia that gets the atmospheric rivers, whereas in winter it really turns around to the west, which is quite interesting. And I've got the same for the lower intensity ones. So again, moves around to the west in winter and the south in summer. Now these you don't have to look at too closely, there's a lot going on in them, but essentially what I just wanted to show here is that there was a very specific pattern going on with the landfalls. It's about every 6 years there's a peak in it. That was something I really wanted to investigate as well. And this is my last slide, and this is sort of my main results that I wanted to include in my paper. And these are those composites that I was talking about before. So these are basically, when I compare the moisture transport of all the atmospheric river events compared to the moisture transport of just your average every day over the 22 years, these are the anomalies that we come up with. So the way that I find best to read these figures is basically the more red, or the hot spot that's there, basically represents the more atmospheric rivers that affect there. So you can see I've broken it down by summer and winter, and then I've broken it down also by some phases of teleconnections that affect us. And that is just basically fulfills my aim of looking at the spatial and temporal characteristics of atmospheric rivers, and essentially the patterns that emerge when you break it down and see how they relate to larger scale climate variability, and possibly in the future be built on to bring together some sort of predictive capacity for predicting atmospheric rivers over Australia. Thank you for listening. I think questions are at the end, but I have a little video. And that's me.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Cara. Well, I believe we're throwing across next to Sophie, who is on the line. So we'll stop sharing here. And Sophie, if you want to unmute and share on your end.
Okay, no worries. Hi guys. So this is me, Sophie. Let me just get my presentation up. Okie dokie. So, hi. Well, if we're going to get started then. So, for those of you that don't know, my name's Sophie Kalkowski-Pope, and I'm actually an undergraduate student at the minute studying marine science and geography. So that's in science and arts, dual degree. So at the beginning of the year, I was lucky enough to be able to participate in a program called Science Under Sail, which is a program, hang on, that's not working. There we go. A program that seeks to monitor the seagrass habitats within Moreton Bay. So they train up high school and university level students in like the art of like research, data management, field methods, surveying, all sorts of different practical field research skills, essentially. And all of this while learning how to sail. So this occurs on Velila, a 12-foot cruising catamaran turned research vessel that's been operating under SUSA, Science Under Sail, for about 5 years now. And these programs are run by James Udy. So, before we get into the specifics of the program itself, I would like to give you a little bit of a reminder about why seagrass is important, because it's actually a really essential habitat. So, quite a lot of species spend a significant portion of their life as juveniles in seagrasses. It's a nursery ground, essentially, and this supports not only commercial fisheries, but recreational fisheries as well. Seagrass has a really important role in seafloor stabilization and also water quality, because not only does it like prevent sediment resuspension by trapping it in the soil, it also slows the water velocity, which allows those particles to settle. Seagrass is also really important for blue carbon, so that's a real big like buzzword at the minute, but it's true. The carbon's stored in the roots, in the leaves, in the sediment, so it's a really important carbon sink, I guess. And also things like threatened species like dugongs, they preferentially graze Halophila ovalis, this one colonizing species of seagrass. So, and I guess we also have like social aspects as well, so value to the community, and it all links back to your triple bottom line. Also, monitoring. So that's a really important part of our program, and I think for me at least there's 3 key reasons why monitoring is important. Firstly, to set a baseline, you need an estimate of your overall ecosystem health so that you kind of understand where you're at. Then secondly, documenting trends over time. You need to be able to see which direction your ecosystem is progressing in and whether it's improving or not, unfortunately. And finally, to review management strategies. If you put in place a strategy like a marine park that you're hoping will work, you want to be able to review if that does work. So, back to SUSA. Moreton Bay actually has 7 different species of seagrass that range right from the like intertidal zone to about an average depth of 5 meters, but we've found them as deep as 12, so that was doing little duck dives down to 12 meters, though not everyone goes down to that depth, because obviously we want to make these programs as accessible as we can to everyone. So on the left side of the screen, you've got your typically really fast growing colonizing species like the Halophila ovalis, which I mentioned the dugongs like. Then you've got your really slow growing long species on the right, like your Cymodocea. So I guess all this diversity out there in our own Moreton Bay, which we typically think of as kind of dirty, muddy, not particularly a nice place to be until you get over on the eastern side. So why the diversity? Well, actually, before I do that, I would like to just give you a bit of a scale of how big this stuff can actually get. So that's a piece of seagrass there sitting next to a student, probably at least half a meter, maybe 60 centimeters long, and thick beds of this stuff, which is amazing. Very cool to see. So seagrass is affected by a whole heap of different variables, including nutrient levels, wave action, currents, and turbidity. So currents, like for instance, the channel in between Stradbroke and Moreton Island can be, the tidal action can be really powerful there. Wave action can disrupt them. Nutrient levels are really important in terms of competition, and turbidity in your light is obviously the most important factor there, as these are photosynthesizing organisms. So they need light to survive. They're also the only flowering species of underwater plant, which I think is very cool. So combinations of these factors lead to like a really big range of ecological niches, and that's why we get the species diversity that we do see. I think before I came into this program, one of the really big misconceptions I had was actually about the diversity within seagrass and within Moreton Bay. So I'd just like to share a little clip with you about some of the organisms that we actually see out there. So lots and lots of juvenile fish. You've even got baby leather jackets in there. And so this was filmed from one of our underwater cameras, which I'll tell you more about later. Even have a little shark coming in. So you get to see lots and lots of interesting stuff out there. And it just goes to show, even though it might be murky water underneath the surface, there's a lot going on. There we go. Okay, so in terms of our data, we collect lots of different data from one particular site. Obviously, GPS coordinates are really important, so we get kind of the spatial cover. Then you have things like your species is really important, the percentage cover, the type of seafloor sediment, whether it's more sandy or more muddy, the percentage of algae cover, that's also really important. Your epiphytes, so those are little growths that occur on the seaweed itself, not seaweed, seagrass, and the types of fauna present as well. So for instance, like recording the amount of algae present is really important because this can be a big indicator of nutrient pollution, for instance, from the Brisbane River. So we documented quite a bit of this toxic cyanobacteria algae called Lingaba around the mouth of the Brisbane River, and that's because of all of the nutrient runoff from there. So in terms of actually obtaining this data, we have 3 different methods. So you've got your underwater surveys like snorkeling, your baited remote underwater video, or BRUVs, so that was what filmed those fish before, and also we have towed underwater cameras. So I have a bit of a video to explain this to you guys as well. I'll probably talk over the top of that. So yeah, there we go. So it's also just like a bit of a pitch for the program, but as I explained before, 3 main sampling techniques. So we get a lot of high school age students coming along, and they sometimes run trips up and down the Queensland coast, so involving a large range of students. So for the snorkel samples, diver dives down, we generally get an assessment of the coral cover, and we'd like to take a sample of the seagrass itself, because what you'll find is there's often an understory. So there'll be this main dominant seagrass which you can see, but then there'll be little cryptic species underneath that you won't actually be able to see with the naked eye. You need to bring it back up to the boat so you can analyse what type of species you're finding. Yeah, and that gives us time to properly identify them as well. So you can see some of the Halophora ovalis there, which is the smaller one underneath. So we have our BRUVs too, so the baited remote underwater cameras, set up with little bait traps that are placed in front of the camera to attract fauna from the around area. And then we leave them underwater for 1 hour and come back and collect them later. So all different kinds of life that we can see. This footage is from the eastern side of the bay too, so that generally has better water quality and visibility. So the final method we use is a remote underwater camera, so that's wirelessly connected. We also have a cable connected to it as well, and that's towed behind the boat. And the great thing about this is we can get really long stretches of video kind of and documenting how the species composition changes over time. Yeah, and then get to relax in the afternoon as we sail back to the boat. So that's our data. So on the most recent trips over summer, we documented 3,000 unique sites, which is, when you start totaling that up over the years, actually adds up to quite a bit of data. So in terms of what trends we've actually been able to document from this, so we have, for those of you that haven't really spent a lot of time around Moreton Bay, in between Stradbroke and Moreton Island, we have this area called the Banks, and there's really significant seagrass meadows over there. Often you get big congregations of dugongs, and better seagrass health on the eastern side than the west. So that's due to water quality issues from the Brisbane River, large amounts of sediment being pumped out, and like the water retention times there can be really high, as opposed to on the eastern side where you have sort of this tidal influx that really allows fresh water to come in. Something that's been really interesting is up in Deception Bay, we've actually seen seagrass recovery there in areas that were previously dead zones, so that's really exciting. And we've also been documenting the southernmost extent of seagrass in Moreton Bay down to the south at around Long Island, so going up through mangrove channels and stuff like that. So in terms of the partnerships of this program as well, we're affiliated with Healthy Land and Water, so that's a local group working here in Brisbane, but also with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and the Marine Park Authority. So the data gets shared with them and is being collated into a big database there that can hopefully one day lead to some really useful analysis. And in terms of why this program is unique, there has been some surveying done in the Moreton Bay area before, but not enough, I would argue. And a lot of the approaches sort of showing the seagrass extent maps are to do with modelling techniques, which are practical, but not always correct. And what we're trying to do is get out there and get the physical data and really show how that matches up. Yeah, so I guess that's sort of the advantage of what we're doing. Finishing up now, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please get in contact with me. Ooh, that's my little time reminder. I'd be more than happy to get you in contact and with the people who run the program. So it is actually a paid program to get involved. I was lucky enough to work on the boat as an assistant crew, so that was a fantastic opportunity. But there are scholarships available as well for academic or financial hardship. They do trips all the way up and down the Queensland coast. So at the moment they're doing one of those voyages at the moment and contacting school children and getting them out on the boat and doing research methods. Both on land and liveaboard trips available, and just really great research skills and networking opportunities. So if you're up for a challenge, this is the place to be. Yeah, thank you so much. If you've got any questions, I'm sure we'll be able to answer them at the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sophie. That was fantastic and really fascinating work. So we'll move on now to our last presenter of the evening, Ben, to provide us with a bit of an overview of recent experiences as well.
Wonderful. Cool. I'll just wait for the screen to be shared, and then I'll crack straight into it. Get my mouse ready.
Oh, one second.
Pretty much video.
Okay.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, John. So hi, everyone. I'm honoured to speak to you today a bit about some of my experiences and reflections on the last 18 months that I've spent outside of uni working in the Queensland government as part of the Policy Futures graduate program. So I've come up with 5 tips that I think from my own experience might be helpful as you start to think. For you guys that are still in uni and studying, that might be helpful to work out what might be next after study for you. And my path is really just one of the places geography can lead. Obviously, you've heard from Cara and Sophie, who are doing amazing work too, and that can lead you in completely different places to where I've decided to go. So I was born and raised in Brisbane, went to a Christian school in the North Side, where I owe a lot of my faith, but also my career direction to. And that man in the photo is that was actually my geography teacher. You can see some beautiful diagrams he's drawing on the whiteboard. His passion for students, his passion for teaching, the amount of time he had for us, I think teachers like that are so incredible, and he's the reason I owe my interest in geography. I owe that to him. So really grateful for that, because that allowed me then to go to the University of Queensland and decided to enroll in a Bachelor of Science majoring in Geographical Sciences. Now, I could never quite work out whether I wanted to do physical or human geography, so I ended up doing a mix of both. And I actually remember graduating at the end of 2016, and I kind of got to the end of the graduation ceremony and celebrating with John and a few others, and sort of walking around and realizing I felt a bit empty, like I kind of realized I wasn't ready to leave yet. The Geographical Sciences degree is great. I found like I got a lot of little bits and pieces, but I felt like I needed to do something a bit in depth. So I kind of didn't really know what to do next, but I figured I'd kind of go for the greatest form of procrastination I could do and prolong all my important life decisions by a year to do honours, which was actually really worth it. So highly recommend. But I did my honours on evaluating a community-based climate change adaptation project in Kiribati, which is a tiny little island country of 33 coral atolls kind of sitting on the equator in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So I don't want to dwell on this too much because I want to talk more about what I've done after uni, but I will just show you a few quick photos because I think they're interesting. So Kiribati is spread across a huge area, but the red circle you can see on that screen there is the most heavily populated island called Tarawa. And so if we zoom in a little further, you can see that the blue bit's obviously water, and you can see a tiny bit of land all the way around the edge. So if you look at the land just at the bottom there, it's about 40 kilometers long, but only a few hundred meters wide, sort of at its widest point. So as far as that looks like when you're flying in, it's actually quite surreal in a way, because you've got the lagoon freshwater lens in that middle there, and the bit you can see on the bottom left, the darker water, is the ocean. And you're kind of looking for where's the plane going to land here? Not quite sure where it's going, but alas, we landed safely. So you can see as well when you're driving along the main road, there's places like this where you see looks pretty normal, right? And then you go a bit further. You've got a bit of a narrower road across, kind of connecting two islands. There's maybe room for a footpath on the side, maybe room for a picnic or something, but not a lot more. And then you get to places like this, which is a huge causeway where you've got the road and some low barriers and not much else. So you can really see, like in a country like this, where you've got the impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise, saltwater inundation, some of those coastal surges and storm surges really affecting the freshwater resources, and also just compounding a lot of development challenges that Kiribati is kind of facing at the moment. So I kind of won't go into that any further because I could speak on it for a while, but I want to talk a bit about what I've kind of been up to after university. So I kind of got to the end of my honours and I took about a 6-month break, just as kind of like a gap year sort of thing, and then started to look for some work. I really wanted to continue on the trajectory I started with honours, which was trying to find a job to do with climate change adaptation, but I could not really find any entry-level jobs. And I kind of guess that brings me to my first top tip that I'd give you, and that would be to try and keep busy, I guess, while you're looking for work, while you're looking for that kind of big graduate job. Just try and find something. It took me actually until October to find the role that I'm in now, after finishing that prior December, so a good 10 months. But in the meantime, I found a lot of joy volunteering with AYCC. I didn't get permission from that. Actually, I didn't ask permission from that person, so I've just given them a smiley face. But campaigning with AYCC, that is the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. So yeah, doing campaign events, door knocking, running market stalls, calling volunteers, all really good volunteer experience. And also some very brief work with a small climate change consultancy in the Whitsundays. So that work only lasted for a week. It was just a bit of surveying, so nothing particularly analytical or anything. But yeah, fantastic experience. And I guess the point I'm getting at with getting involved with these sort of things, I think there's really 3 key bits, and that's that it's great experience to your resume, just chuck it on and it fills it out a bit more. The networks you build through things like volunteering and doing work wherever you can, you'll find people, especially if you volunteer, you'll find people interested in the same things you are. You'll get a bit of an idea where the work is, where they're working. And it's just good to surround yourself with people who are kind of in a similar stage, I guess. And also just, it's really practical, but some good examples for job interviews of like situations that you've been in outside of university that might come in really handy. So the second thing I'd say is, the second top tip is to reach out to people, for instance, on LinkedIn, or even at university that's in a field that you want to work in, say in the next 5 years, just to try and ask them some questions about how they got there, what their experience was like. You can do it over coffee, you can do virtual or not, you do you, but it doesn't have to even be a dreaded cold call, although if that's your thing, that's cool too. A brief email or message over LinkedIn will do the job. People love to talk about themselves, as I guess all of us have demonstrated a bit tonight. But yeah, I think if you just find someone who has a job that you're kind of really keen to get in the future, you can learn so much from them, just those little things you wouldn't pick up otherwise about how they got there and what sort of they'd suggest for someone in your position to focus on when you're looking for a role like that. So I still really didn't have any luck around September, and I had pretty high expectations for the job I would get, which wasn't really realistic. So I was trying to find a climate change adaptation job, I guess, because that's what I had done my honours in. But I guess I didn't really want to admit it, but I didn't really have the skills or experience really to back that up, which kind of leads me to my third tip, which is to focus on the skills first and kind of worry about the context later. And so what I mean by that is that it's kind of really rare to actually get your dream job straight out of university. A lot of people kind of get whatever job they can. And as you enter the workforce, you'll kind of realize that you kind of first need to build up those skills and experience, and then you can kind of move sideways and learn the content, or if you already have the content in the background, that's great, but you can kind of learn the content a bit later. So for instance, with like a climate change job, I'm not quite there yet, but I think I've learned so much in my current role, which I'll talk about soon, just about communication and about how, you know, good, concise writing, all that sort of good stuff that will obviously come in handy later. And I just needed to build those skills up first, I think. So if we go to the next slide, I'm in control, I just remembered that. So I eventually actually found something, I realized, yeah, climate change isn't gonna happen. I'll see what grad programs are out there. And I was lucky to get into the Policy Futures graduate program with the Queensland government. So this is a point where I say that everything I say now is my perspectives only. It doesn't represent anything the government thinks, or in no way, shape or form is anything I say reflective of the government. This is my personal experience only. So the good thing about this grad program is 2 years long. I'm 18 months into it now. So it comprises 2 6-month rotations and 12-month rotation at the end in 3 different government departments. You get a mentor, you get a buddy, you get really good on-the-job training, as well as really structured training. But if you're wondering a bit what actual policy is, that's a question I've been asking for a while, but I've kind of found a good definition on the internet, which I think is that policy is really an action, or like a set of actions that the government decides to do in order to solve a problem. So I know that's really vague and broad, but I want to give a bit of an example. So my first rotation in the Department of Transport and Main Roads, we were working on the road rules, and specifically the road rules for electric bikes or e-bikes. So we had a bit of a problem where the definition of what an electric bike actually was pretty unclear. So there are examples of like some electric moped bikes on the Gold Coast riding along footpaths and you know, occasionally hitting people and so on. And while they were technically illegal, because the law just wasn't really clear, it was a bit difficult to prosecute people and kind of stop these being on the road at some point. So we reviewed the laws, worked out what the intent of our new policy needed to be, consulted kind of with stakeholders and people we needed to consult with, checked the legislation and drafted it with our legal team, passed it through Parliament, and yeah, we were able to implement the laws successfully and cap it off with a trip to the Gold Coast to be able to talk to some stakeholders and local businesses who had these bikes about the new laws we had put in place. And I think that's kind of policy in a nutshell. It's really about identifying a problem, finding the best solution, and then working to implement that solution with whoever you need to. So the next rotation I had at the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy, and if you're wondering where the geography part comes in, this is probably it. So I was able to use my GIS skills to kind of work out where renewable energy sites were across Queensland. I was able to trace them and kind of create this body of evidence for us to, I guess, then do some real policy on. For instance, where we would locate like a renewable energy zone, perhaps where there were lots of renewable energy sites located closely together, or maybe if there are a lot in central Queensland, we need to build some more power lines out there to make sure that power is transported properly. And last of all, my final rotation where I am now is the Department of Housing and Public Works. So that's been a bit of a mix of things just because of COVID, obviously, has changed priorities. But it's a lot of like working with the border application process, a lot of coronavirus work, but also some work to kind of support people in the community. And I guess that kind of gets me to my fourth point, which is say yes to as many opportunities as you can. I was asked to go and work in a call centre to support Queenslanders who needed food or medication or anything like that, needed help to get that. And I'm really glad I said yes. I was like, oh, call centre doesn't really kind of do it for me. But yeah, amazing opportunity. You don't know what you're going to get into until you say yes. And if you really don't like it, there's generally always a way out. So I guess that brings me to my top 5. I know there's only 4 there. I'll get to that. So the first one is keep busy while you look for work with whatever experience you can. Reach out to some experienced people in your field and see what you can learn. Don't be disheartened if you don't get your dream job at first. You can always get the skills and then find that job later, and it'll put you in a much better position, and you'll be much more ready for it too, I think, when you get to that point. And say yes to any opportunities as much as you can. And the last one I'd like to do, it's a bit philosophical, but I just remind people like not to lose sight of your purpose. I think when you get to a full-time job, it can be easy to become a bit jaded over time when you're just doing the 9-to-5 grind, particularly if you're not in your dream job straight away. I've kind of needed to remind myself lately that even though I have the job I have, which I'm extremely lucky to have, I need to continue to follow what I'm passionate about and try and find that climate change career. So I just advise you guys to, as you kind of get into that, remind yourself of why you've studied what you've studied, why you're going into what you're going into. For me, it's, again, a bit about my faith and kind of trying to conserve the planet, this beautiful world around us we have as much as possible. And if you're passionate about similar environmental issues, go along to rallies, keep those people around you who are interested in those same causes. And yeah, just find people that lift you up and stick by them. Work can consume a lot of your life, so you've got to make it good. So happy to answer any questions because I think we're going into the panel discussion shortly, and I'm sorry I went a bit over, but thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was really great. There we go. So, as Ben said, we're now diving into our panel session of questions. And I will have to rotate my screen slightly so everyone can see these. But please start throwing your questions up into the chat and we'll start distributing them out to the various presenters. That wants to appear.
Noticed we had a couple from Jonathan, which might be good to start off with.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to answer those. So thank you, Jonathan. Great questions. First thing I'd like to say is obviously I am just a student/assistant crew participating in this program. I'm not actually the one running it or necessarily analysing the data. But from what I've heard talking to James Judy, has been running the program for a number of years, my very limited experience over summer. Excellent and engaging experience nonetheless. But the next 22 years, Moreton Bay, as you would know, as a professor at the university, I'm assuming, the water quality there is largely dictated by the Brisbane River and all of the outflows and nutrient and sediment outfluxes from that. So the fate of Moreton Bay is largely determined in part by the fate of the Brisbane River. So I think looking at controlling nutrient runoff is really important in terms of like Lingabar outbreaks, especially around the mouth. Sorry, just thought someone wanted to come in from the waiting room. There we go, they're in. So yeah, Lingabar is like a really big problem around the mouth of the Brisbane River, but and that can be controlled by obviously cleaning up the agriculture further upstream. And there's even been some really interesting work done in relation to oyster reefs. So I heard that there was like Healthy Land Waters was possibly discussing something about the potential to have oyster reefs at the mouth of the Brisbane River, but that's obviously still just an idea at the moment. But I think there's also promise that, like, as we said, up in Deception Bay, we've seen a lot of recovery from what was previously a dead zone. So that's really exciting. And from my understanding, the water quality has been progressively improving over the years, but it's all linked. It's all linked to the river. Yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Very nice. Thank you, Sophie. We've got so many questions coming in. I think we'll throw to Cara next and maybe start off with Sienna's question. Is there any evidence that atmospheric rivers have changed in the past or changing due to climate change?
Yes, so that is a great question, Sienna. Thank you. So I haven't focused too much on the past just because my dates of my study start from 1998. So in terms of past climate with atmospheric rivers, that's not really the scope that I was looking at, and I can't really speak to that. And obviously from 1998 to now is all going to have been during the time where we do know about climate change and humans are influencing the climate. So in terms of what we are likely to see in the future with regards to climate change and the trends that we're seeing now is as the atmosphere warms, it can obviously hold more moisture. So if we're getting more moisture in the atmosphere, a lot of the predictions are saying that we're going to get more intense atmospheric rivers because you're going to get these systems being able to hold a lot more moisture, and therefore they're going to have the capacity to drop a lot more moisture and in terms of flooding, flash flooding, heavy rainfall. And most of the predictions say, like many things with climate change, very similar to the precipitation trends where it's likely going to be an increase in extremes. So you're more likely to get stronger atmospheric river events. What's the word? The more extreme atmospheric river events, or the stronger ones, will become stronger, basically, which will have quite big ramifications for lots of places around the world. I know in terms of Australia, as you saw, those systems tend to have a northwest, southeast orientation. So it means that atmospheric rivers are actually really important for our Murray-Darling Basin stream flow, and they actually can contribute about 90% to, they're very important for high flows and very important for low flows. So not having atmospheric rivers increases your chances of very low streamfall and hydrological drought there by about 90%. So that is going to have huge ramifications for the future. But yeah, I guess stop rambling, the short answer there is that the extreme events will most likely become more extreme because they're able to hold more moisture.
Nice. I'm going to keep you rambling for a second.
Yeah.
I thought this seemed to link in well with the question, if you scroll up a little bit, John, from Steve about the patterns with the other teleconnections. You had the La Nina and El Nino in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
From what you've done so far, which is of course just a little snapshot, but would you expect to see the interactions with the other teleconnections also kind of playing into what we can expect to see in the future? So intensifying further, or?
Yeah, so that was also a really good question. So those are the other two obviously teleconnections that I've looked at. So I've looked at the El Nino Southern Oscillation and the patterns in that, and I've looked at Indian Ocean Dipole and also the Southern Annular Mode. So you would have seen in the graphs I put up, I briefly talked about how there was quite a cyclical trend in the number of atmospheric rivers hitting Australia, and I've been trying to figure out what explains that variability. And so far, the best predictor of that I've found so far is actually the Southern Annular Mode. So it looks like our atmospheric rivers correlate really well with that. And if anyone doesn't know what that is, the Southern Annular Mode is basically the variability of our westerlies and our really strong westerly winds. So depending on whether it's a positive phase of SAM or a negative phase, those winds will either travel further north and be sort of more across the bottom of Australia, or they'll fall further south. And that has a lot of impacts for our rainfall, for our climate more broadly. So it looks like lines up quite nicely with that. And in terms of those composites that I had at the end, those nice pictures, the positive SAM tends to occur more with a La Nina. So we see both the composites for those almost completely identical, which is really nice that lines up. And the same with in winter particularly, and summer, both of them, the La Nina composites tend to line up really well with the negative Indian Ocean dipole composites as well, which we would expect because they generally occur in phase. Yeah, I hope that answered your question a little bit. Really?
Nice. All right, I think we'll throw over to Ben now. There was a question a little bit further, right there. Yeah, what do you feel geography has given you uniquely and able to be able to prepare for the workforce?
Thanks for the question, Jonathan. I guess I'll say two things quickly. The first is that I think geography is a really beneficial degree to have, just to have, like, I remember in primary school when it was still called SOS, which is Studies of Society and Environment. Like, I think that captures it really well in a way. Just being able to have an understanding of having come from a geography background. Even I'll go back to issues of climate change and sustainability, like especially in government and in other places at the moment, because that's becoming such a crucial issue. That's getting built into all sorts of activities that are getting done, and to have an understanding of what sustainability is, what climate change is, what the kind of objective is that we're working towards with that, and with trying to be more sustainable. Yeah, just really important, I think, to have that knowledge. The other point I was going to make, which I have forgotten now. I'll go back to you on that if we have more time at the end, but I'll go with that answer for now.
Cool. Very good. Well, definitely, if you think of it, let us know. We'll come back to you. I feel like we'd all sort of echo that to some extent. And that it's really nice to sort of learn about you're talking about context and skills. Do you feel like geography's placed you well in terms of sort of understanding the context of the world, how things sort of interrelate in a way that sort of unique to the discipline?
Yeah. That actually reminds me of what I was going to say. So thank you. I was going to say, so that, yeah, what I was saying before, that definitely provides a more broad overview. I think as far as the specific things that geography gives you, being able to learn some GIS skills and being able to learn how maps work, how to create maps, how to make maps look appealing, and to be able to convey the information you want to convey, and knowing that people can lie with maps. That's all important information, because the amount of, as well, I'm just going to speak from a government perspective because that's my background, but maps are used so heavily, I think, for so many different things, and a lot of the people who make the maps aren't the people who use the maps. So being able to bridge that gap is also something geography, I think, has really helped me to do.
All right, let's throw back to Sophie with a question I actually had as well. What's the difference between seagrass and seaweed? For us uneducated.
One of my lecturers, Catherine Lovelock, is very adamant about this because she gets really upset when people get them confused. But I'm by no means an expert. But so your seaweeds are actually algae. They're so I guess like simpler than seagrasses in terms of like the evolutionary spectrum, because your seagrasses are actually vascular plants. In fact, they're angiosperms. So angiosperms are flowering plants. I mentioned that earlier. I'm pretty sure they're the only underwater angiosperms. So it's amazing. You can be swimming along in meadows and see little flowers poking up underneath the ocean. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions. Seaweed is algae, so sort of like includes your kelps and stuff like that, but seagrasses are plants.
Nice. Also from Daniel, we had another question for Cara about where your data comes from and sort of a bit more about your predictive modelling capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, so the data comes from, so I basically started with a base data set of specific humidity, horizontal wind, vertical wind, and also cloud fraction as well, just because I wanted to investigate and more clearly the links with northwest cloud bands. So all that data came from, was freely available through the ERA 5 data set on the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. And they all have this data freely available to download. I think you have to make an account, but it's free. And then it's it's high resolution, and they've got it from 1973, I believe, to present. And it's six hourly data. So my poor laptop had to download that, but that's a whole other story. And then basically from that base data, I then made a Python script to calculate this moisture transport value, which is the value that we use to identify atmospheric rivers. And basically it is a complex looking formula, but it's basically just the combination of specific humidity, so the amount of moisture in the air, and the horizontal and vertical winds across 20 pressure levels. So it integrates it into one, it integrates all the pressure levels into one layer, basically. So that gives you the full name of it is vertically integrated water vapor transport. And that's what all those really colourful maps were with the bright orange. So that's a high IVT value, we call it. And then that IVT is then what gets fed into the actual detection algorithm. And I guess in terms of prediction, I by no means would say that my model or algorithm has predictive capacity yet. As I sort of mentioned before, no one's looked at atmospheric rivers over Australia in general yet. So my main aim of this study was to put together a catalogue of events and to start looking at the patterns that we see. So that's very much a stepping stone, I would say, for future studies and future research to start building some predictive capacity. But my results, I wouldn't say are predictive yet, but hopefully in the future.
Question for everyone, just out of more curiosity than anything else. What would you say is the biggest challenge right now that you're facing, either as a young professional, student, whatever part of your career life you're currently in? I'll start with them.
I wasn't expecting that. That's a tough question. I think that last part I put in my presentation, I guess, about finding kind of your purpose and the why you're doing things, I guess that's been on my mind at the moment. Just kind of because the graduate program is coming to an end, and it's actually one of those programs where you don't have continuing employment afterwards. The contract sort of finishes, and you kind of need to find something, or you'll need to find another job. So I think I'm kind of thinking of that at the moment, and because I haven't gotten to do a lot of environmental related policy work so far, yeah, just kind of thinking about what's next. And I think that's a challenge because obviously everyone is in difficult circumstances at the moment. Yeah, whether it's trying to study online or looking for work, or yeah, I think it's difficult, and I'm so lucky to have what I have with secure employment. So yeah, I think it's just looking ahead and thinking about those next 6 months.
Sophie?
I guess on a similar note there, sort of looking to the future. Obviously it's not as urgent for me because I still have 2 years left of my degree, but trying to maximize my opportunities while I'm at uni by doing projects like this, by getting into contact with lecturers, really seeking those opportunities as much as I can, while also balancing a full-time study load and college and all the other things that come with that. But I feel like the environmental world in terms of job prospects is difficult. It fluctuates a lot, at least from what I've heard from people, and trying to find stable employment that also kind of aligns with your interests. You know, we've had other people in the panel speaking on that tonight, but trying to maximize opportunities and just really make the most of it, I guess. Yeah.
All right, to round us out.
Yeah. I guess for me, the challenge at the moment is sort of been the opposite. It's very much been in the present, because I took on a job this year as well. So I've been, so at the moment I'm working 4 days a week and then spending the rest, the other 3 on my honours project, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend. But I was very lucky to get this job at the start of the year. So I work in GIS at the moment in the private sector with a consulting company. And I do really enjoy that work, which if you had asked me like 3 years ago if I had been working in GIS, I would have been like, no. But I actually really enjoy GIS, and I'm a total math nerd now. And it's been really great because both opportunities have very much mutually, in some ways, been very, very difficult, but in other ways, it's been really helpful to have both. Like my job has really increased my GIS skills a lot, and so has doing this honours project. So like you would have seen most of my maps, they're all done on ArcGIS. So for me, it's been very mutually beneficial, but this year has also been very difficult, and time management has definitely been a struggle. And I'm looking forward to being able to come home from work at night and just have the night off. But I guess that's been the biggest challenge, is sort of taking on a job and also trying to do a full-time study load, which is doable. I'm still here, but you definitely have to be able to plan your time well.
Was there one final question from Jonathan there? Just further up the chat. It was asking about the greatest challenges associated with gathering the seagrass data. So there's lots of different things that can go wrong, obviously, like cameras malfunctioning, flooding, boat problems, God knows. But I think probably the biggest challenge generally is water quality issues, especially with some of the GIS technologies that we've been talking about tonight. When the water quality is poor, you can't get you can't see through the water in cloudy or murky areas, and that is a real problem for trying to get an indicator of what the substrate's like underneath there. And that's where we come in. But that's also challenging, because when we're trained to dive, they teach us to dive with our hand out in front of our face, because sometimes it's so murky you can't see the bottom. And so we reach out to get a sample because we need to identify them, firstly, but secondly, because sometimes the water is literally so murky that we have to have our face in the seagrass to be able to see it. And that just really speaks to, I guess, some of the levels of sediment and nutrients coming out of the Brisbane River. So that definitely is challenging, I guess, mentally, like diving into these really murky waters, but just logistically as well. But we make it work.
Lovely, thank you, Sophie. We will finish up with one final question that's popped up in the chat from Kevin. This is another one that goes out to everyone. And after this question, I think we'll finish up. We plan to go for an hour. We've gone just over, so we'll wrap it up after this. Keep it nice and short so we don't chew up too much of everyone's evening. So the final question: what are the most important geography skills that you learned in high school, or even undergraduate, if that's applicable, that translate towards your current projects, whether that be work, whether that be your study, or research projects, either internally in uni or externally for you, Sophie, that you've been involved with? Should we start again with you, Ben? Be back under the pump again.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I think for me, at my high school at least, geography wasn't particularly detailed, or like it didn't. I wouldn't say that I did geography in high school and thought I definitely want to do geography in undergraduate. That was more something that came from. So I knew I wanted to do something in environmental science, but I wouldn't say that it was geography that got me there. And I remember when I was looking for courses, geographical science looked like it was the one that had the most options, as Ben I think touched on earlier. It was human and physical geography, so I kind of thought, well, I'll definitely find something in here, like one strand to go into. And as you saw from my presentation, it was a lot more the atmospheric science and meteorology, so a bit more the physical science route. But in terms of skills, for me it was definitely GIS, which is a bit of a predictable one, just because it's really got me where I am today. And when I was doing it in second year course, I remember just really thinking, am I going to use this? I'm not sure. It seems really complicated. ArcGIS seems really hard to deal with, but I'm so glad that I kept at it, because it's so rewarding. And as someone that's a very visual learner, to actually be able to work with spatial software has been so beneficial. I would not have been able to do my honours project, and I did an undergraduate project last year on the atmospheric science side of things as well, and that wouldn't have been possible without GIS. So definitely GIS for me, I would say.
So I think for me, Kevin, I think one of the biggest things is, I'll touch on something a bit different. I think maybe even just the report writing and being able to do some of those assignments, especially that you might get towards year 12. I'm not sure if you're in school at the moment, and you're probably at the end of year 12 anyway, if you are in year 12, so that might not be helpful. But yeah, in that latest stage of high school, being able to write reports well, I think, and just understanding, you'll just get it through experience. Yeah, just learning what makes a good report and getting feedback on drafts and all that stuff is really helpful just to hone your writing skills generally.
And Sophie?
Okay, so probably the youngest presenter here, so freshest out of high school, but interestingly enough, I didn't actually study geography in high school and transferred into it at university. Sort of the appeal for me, I guess, was, as Cara touched on, the really broad range of subjects, just being able to kind of expand my interests. So as I said, I also study marine, but I wanted to be able to round that out with an understanding of land and society as well. I guess, so given that I haven't studied geography in school, but some of the skills that I do use a lot now in this work and just in uni in general would probably be like my photography and videography skills. They come in really handy just in a whole different range of projects. But also stuff like just a basic understanding of Google Earth Pro, being able to like, I've used that in a few different subjects, and graphic design skills as well transfer really well across multiple different like projects and presentations, and I think science communication is a really important skill nowadays, and so being able to make your presentations like hopefully engaging and interesting is always valuable. So yeah, that's all from me.
Very nice. All three quite different things from our different speakers, which I think speaks quite nicely to how broad geography is, and how much you can very much make it what you want it to be and get what you want out of it. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for presenting tonight. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'll pass back across to John to wrap up for us.
Brilliant. And so thank you so much for joining us. If you want to re-watch any part of this presentation, we'll be looking to release a recording in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye on your emails and on the Society's website. As always, if you're not a member of the Society yet, membership for students is free. And we have a lot of great activities and new things coming along into the future to provide new opportunities and to engage with a really broad variety of interesting and dynamic people across the whole spectrum of geography. So once again,
if there is something that you would like us to look into as well, also let us know. We're definitely keen to cater towards the interests of people in the group. So give us a shout out on the Facebook group if you're part of it, or you could message Sean or I individually, or send it through to the RGSQ email address. They'll pass it on to us as well.
Awesome. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you very soon. Good night, everyone.